When Barron Trump stepped out of his usual quiet and private life, he never expected the past to catch up with him in such an unexpected way. It all began on a chilly afternoon in New York City when he was leaving Trump Tower. The streets were busy, filled with people rushing to their destinations, the usual mix of locals, tourists, and street vendors. But on this particular day, someone from his past was waiting, someone he hadn't thought about in years. Standing by the curb, wrapped in an old coat, was a man whose face seemed oddly familiar. He wasn't just another passerby or a stranger, hoping for a handshake. He was staring at Barron, his eyes filled with recognition, almost as if he had been waiting for this very moment. And then, in a voice that was both hesitant and hopeful, he spoke, "Barron? Do you remember me?" At first, Barron was taken aback. His security detail immediately moved closer, their instincts kicking in. But something about the man's face made him hesitate. There was something there, a memory just out of reach. The man, despite his disheveled appearance, had a certain presence, an air of dignity that hadn't completely faded despite the hardships he had clearly endured. The realization hit like a jolt. "Mr. Carter?" Barron murmured under his breath, barely believing his own words. The man standing before him, homeless and struggling, was none other than one of his old teachers, a man who once stood at the front of a prestigious classroom, educating the children of New York's elite. A flood of memories came rushing back. Mr. Carter had been one of the most passionate teachers Barron had ever known, firm but fair, always pushing his students to think beyond textbooks. He had a way of making history come alive, of making his students feel like they were a part of something greater. And now, here he was, on the streets, barely recognizable. Barron couldn't just walk away. Despite the curious glances from passers-by and the tension among his security team, he stepped forward. "What happened?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. Mr. Carter smiled faintly, as if embarrassed by his circumstances. "Life happened," he said simply. "One bad turn after another. I lost my job, my home, and here I am." The story that followed was heartbreaking. Mr. Carter had been a dedicated teacher for years, beloved by students, but a series of personal tragedies had sent his life into a downward spiral. A sudden illness had wiped out his savings. Then came a school budget cut, which led to his job loss. Without steady income, bills piled up. Soon, he lost his apartment, and one thing led to another, until he found himself on the streets. Despite it all, Mr. Carter hadn't lost his spirit. He still carried himself with a quiet dignity, still spoke with the same articulate passion that had once filled his classroom. But it was clear, he needed help. Barron didn't hesitate. He turned to his security and asked them to arrange a meal and a place for Mr. Carter to stay. But more than that, he wanted to do something long-term. This wasn't just about a kind gesture. It was about recognizing someone who had once played a role in shaping his life. That night, after their conversation, Barron made a few calls. He reached out to organizations that help displaced teachers, to people within his network who might be able to offer Mr. Carter a second chance. And within days, things started to change. Mr. Carter was placed in a program that provided housing and career support. Through Barron's efforts, he was able to reconnect with former colleagues who helped him find tutoring opportunities, a stepping stone toward rebuilding his life. Weeks later, Barron received a letter, handwritten, carefully, folded. It was from Mr. Carter. In it, he expressed his deep gratitude, not just for the help, but for the simple fact that Barron had remembered him, had taken the time to listen and care. The encounter could have been just another fleeting moment, a chance meeting in a city where people cross paths and never think twice. But Barron Trump chose to make a difference, and in doing so, he proved that sometimes the past comes calling not as a burden, but as an opportunity to give back. Barron read the letter twice, then a third time, absorbing every word. It wasn't just a thank you note. It was a reflection of resilience, a testament to the power of kindness and a reminder that even the smallest gestures can change someone's path. In the following weeks, he kept tabs on Mr. Carter's progress. The man who had once stood in front of classrooms was slowly reclaiming his life. With a stable place to stay and tutoring work that helped him regain his confidence, he began to see hope again. But for Barron, this wasn't just about one act of kindness. It made him think deeper about the countless other teachers who had dedicated their lives to education, only to find themselves struggling when systems failed them. It wasn't just Mr. Carter's story. It was a reality for many. One evening, Barron sat down with his mother, Melania, to discuss what more could be done. She listened intently, nodding as he shared Mr. Carter's journey and the larger issue it represented. "There are so many like him," Barron said, "people who gave their lives to teaching, and yet they have nowhere to turn when things go wrong," Melania agreed. "It's a noble profession, but not always a protected one," she said. "Maybe there's something we can do about that." With support from his family and their connections, Barron began quietly working on initiatives to support struggling educators. Whether it was funding for emergency assistance, job placement programs, or mental health support, he wanted to ensure that no teacher would ever have to endure what Mr. Carter had gone through. Though he preferred to stay out of the spotlight, word of his efforts slowly spread. Schools and educators began reaching out, sharing their own stories of struggle and resilience. Some spoke of colleagues who had fallen on hard times, others of their own fears of what could happen if circumstances turned against them. One day, Barron received an unexpected message. It was an invitation to speak at an education forum. He was hesitant at first. Public speaking wasn't something he particularly sought out, but this wasn't about him. This was about the people who had dedicated their lives to shaping the future. When he took the stage, he kept his words simple. He spoke about Mr. Carter, about the impact teachers have, and about the responsibility society has to protect them. "Education is the foundation of everything," he said, "and those who build that foundation deserve more than just gratitude. They deserve security, support, and respect." The audience, a mix of educators, policymakers, and advocates, listened intently. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked as though they were hearing these words from someone in his position for the first time. It wasn't about politics or wealth. It was about humanity. After the event, Barron quietly slipped away from the crowd. He wasn't looking for attention or praise. Instead, he checked his phone, where a new message had arrived. It was from Mr. Carter. It was a simple text, but one that carried immense weight. "Thank you, Barron. Not just for me, but for all of us." As Barron looked out at the city skyline that evening, he realized something. Sometimes life has a way of bringing people back together for a reason. What had started as an unexpected encounter on a busy New York street had turned into something far greater. A single moment of recognition had sparked change, not just for one man, but for many. As Barron sat with his phone in hand, rereading Mr. Carter's message, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just about charity or a single good deed. It was about taking action where it mattered. The impact of that one encounter had already started a ripple effect, and he wasn't about to stop there. Over the next few months, he quietly expanded his efforts. He reached out to educational foundations, business leaders, and philanthropists who shared the same vision. With their help, he was able to support new programs aimed at helping teachers facing financial hardship. Some initiatives provided emergency grants, while others offered career transition assistance for those struggling to find stability. But what moved him most were the personal stories that came pouring in. Letters and emails arrived from teachers across the country, many of whom had never expected someone like Barron Trump to be the one advocating for them. They shared their struggles. Some had been forced to work multiple jobs just to make ends meet. Others had faced unexpected medical crises with no financial safety net. One letter in particular stood out. It was from a retired history teacher in Ohio who had taught for over 30 years before being forced out of the classroom due to budget cuts. He had lost his pension due to administrative errors and was now living in his car. "I never thought I'd end up like this," he wrote. I spent my life giving everything to my students. I don't regret a second of it, but I just wish teachers weren't forgotten when we need help the most. Barron showed the letter to his mother. Melania, ever supportive, encouraged him to continue his work, but also reminded him of the power of awareness. People need to hear these stories, she said. You have a platform. Use it wisely. Though he had always shied away from the public eye, Barron realized she was right. This wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about giving a voice to those who had none. So, for the first time, he decided to personally fund a documentary project highlighting the struggles and triumphs of teachers in America. The documentary followed educators from different backgrounds, some who had found success, others who had fallen on hard times, and those who were fighting to reform the system from within. It wasn't political, nor was it about blame. It was about real people, real sacrifices, and real solutions. When the project was finally released, it gained attention far beyond what Barron had anticipated. Major news outlets picked up the story, and discussions about teacher support began, spreading across social media. Some critics dismissed it as another privileged gesture, but many more saw it for what it truly was, an effort to bring long overdue attention to an issue affecting millions. Through it all, Barron stayed grounded. He wasn't interested in making speeches or becoming the face of a movement. Instead, he continued working behind the scenes, ensuring that the programs he had helped start remained sustainable. One evening, as he was walking through Central Park, he got a call from Mr. Carter. By now, his former teacher had secured a stable job and was even mentoring other educators who had faced similar struggles. "You didn't just help me," Mr. Carter said. "You reminded me that my work still matters." Barron smiled, looking out at the city skyline. "It always did," he replied. As he hung up, he realized something important. Sometimes the past comes calling in ways we never expect. And when it does, we have a choice. We can ignore it, or we can embrace it and use it to make a difference. For Barron Trump, that choice had already been made. As Barron walked through Central Park, the conversation with Mr. Carter lingered in his mind. It wasn't just about one man's redemption. It was about the countless others who had been forgotten by a system that once relied on them. Teachers were the architects of knowledge, the ones who shaped the future, yet so many were left without support when they needed it most. That night, as he sat in his room, he reflected on how far things had come since that chance encounter outside Trump Tower. What had started as a simple act of kindness had turned into something much bigger, a movement of sorts, one that he never planned but couldn't turn away from. In the months that followed, Barron continued expanding his efforts quietly, never seeking attention but making sure the right people were involved. He partnered with organizations that focused on teacher welfare, ensuring that struggling educators had access to financial aid, health care, and mental health support. One evening, he attended a private fundraiser for an education initiative. Unlike the glitzy galas that his family was often invited to, this event was different. It was small, intimate, filled with educators, reformers, and advocates who had dedicated their lives to the cause. As he listened to their stories, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about charity. It was about change. One speaker, a retired principal from Chicago, stood up and said, "We don't need handouts. We need reform. Teachers shouldn't have to depend on donations just to survive. The system itself needs to change." Her words stayed with him long after the event ended. While immediate aid was important, there was a deeper issue at play, one that required long-term solutions. Barron wasn't a politician, nor did he aspire to be one, but he understood the power of influence. Instead of just funding programs, he began connecting with policymakers, urging them to reconsider the way teachers were treated in the workforce. He pushed for better salaries, stronger pension protections, and emergency support systems for educators facing financial hardships. One of the most unexpected moments came when a well-respected senator invited him to a closed-door discussion on education policy. At first, Barron was hesitant. He wasn't an expert, nor did he want to be used for political gain. But after some thought, he agreed, on the condition that it remained focused on real solutions, not publicity. During the meeting, he listened more than he spoke. He absorbed the conversations, took notes, and shared the real stories he had encountered. Stories like Mr. Carter's, like the retired teacher living in his car, like the young educators drowning in student debt with no financial stability. Bark. The end of the discussion, one of the senior policymakers turned to him and said, "You're not just talking about problems, you're actually doing something. That's rare." Barron nodded, but inside, he knew this was just the beginning. Months later, his efforts began to show real results. A new pilot program was launched in several states, offering emergency financial relief to teachers facing unexpected hardships. Some schools even started implementing mentorship programs, pairing struggling educators with experienced ones who could guide them through career challenges. One day, Barron received another message from Mr. Carter. But this time, it wasn't just a thank you. It was an invitation to attend a special ceremony where Mr. Carter was being honored for his resilience and dedication to education. Barron arrived quietly, slipping into the back of the small auditorium. He watched as Mr. Carter took the stage, standing tall, no longer the weary man he had met months ago on the street. The audience erupted in applause as he spoke, not about his struggles, but about the power of second chances. "I was lost," Mr. Carter admitted, his voice steady. "But someone reminded me that my work wasn't done, that my purpose still mattered. And that's the lesson I want to leave you all with. No matter how far you fall, there's always a way back." Barron sat there, absorbing every word. This wasn't about recognition or legacy. It was about impact, about making sure that the people who built the future weren't left behind in the past. As the event ended, Mr. Carter spotted him in the crowd and gave him a small nod. No words were needed. They both knew what this moment meant. As Barron stepped out into the night, he felt something he hadn't expected: clarity. The work wasn't done. In fact, it was just beginning. Because sometimes when the past comes, calling, it's not just a reminder of where you've been, it's a call to action for where you need to go next.